Let's pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts, the thoughts of all our hearts, be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength, our rock, and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Well, we do not hear from the prophet Habakkuk very often on Sunday. In fact, it comes around once every 6 years or so. And because of that, we are going to begin with some of the background of what we know about this prophet and his book. And I'd actually like you to turn there, if you could, in the blue Bibles. This is page 785. We're looking at the book of Habakkuk this morning. 785. It's right after Nahum, if you're keeping score at home. So as you turn there, Habakkuk is the 7th century BC version of, well, a church organist or a choir member. He was actually an important person. He lived in Jerusalem, the capital of the kingdom of Judah, and it appears that he was actually a minister of music at the temple, at God's temple in Jerusalem. So we might say that Habakkuk was, well, the Jimmy Crawford of prophets. And I know you're going to be surprised by this, but when Habakkuk was alive and when he was prophesying, life in Judah, in the kingdom that was built around Jerusalem, it was a mess. Who's surprised to learn that? You know, there's a thing about prophets, is they never write a book of prophecy where it says, yeah, everything's basically okay right now. So usually things are not okay when a prophet is prophesying. So life is a bit of a mess. And this happened because just as Habakkuk is beginning his ministry in the temple, Judah's king, a man named Josiah, mostly a good king it seems, well, Josiah actually chose the wrong side in a war between superpowers. And well, he got killed for his trouble, killed in battle. And when that happened, the first king to follow him only lasts 3 months. So it's clear there's some instability in Judah. And then, they get some stability from a man named Jehoiakim, but he's kind of a no-good relative of Josiah. Jehoiakim is king, but he won't enforce the law. And worse than that, sometimes he took what the law said and he perverted it to serve his own purposes. He's using the law for his own purposes. And Habakkuk, as he's writing this book, he has clearly had enough of that, right? We hear that starting at verse 2, where he says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save?" Violence is something you might cry like if you were getting mugged in the street. Cry to you violence, and you will not save. Why? Why do you make me see iniquity? And why don't you do anything when bad things are happening? And he goes on in verse 4, he says, the law is paralyzed, and justice, it never goes forth. And he says, for the wicked surround the righteous. In other words, Habakkuk is saying, Lord, why is Jehoiakim in charge? And why? Why are you letting Jehoiakim get away with all of this? I mean, he's bad. He's doing bad things to the kingdom. And that's a good question, isn't it? A question that we ourselves may want to ask God sometimes. One of the hard lessons of life is that the best people are not always at the top of the heap, right? And there is something in us that is just dying to see justice for people that deserve it, isn't there? That satisfied feeling we get when we see the person who passed us driving like a dangerous idiot 10 minutes ago pulled over on the side of the road by the police. Yeah, you're smiling. You know that feeling, don't you? It just feels right, doesn't it? That's what Habakkuk is asking for here. He's saying, God, pull this guy over. Get him off the road. He's hurting us. So what does God say? How does he respond to this plea for justice that we can really identify with. Well, verses 5 and 6 here in chapter 1 of Habakkuk, they begin God's response. He says this, he says, "Look among the nations and see wonder and be astounded, for I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told." Now, if I was Habakkuk and I heard that, I would be saying to myself, great, God is going to kick some butt and take some names. But then he goes on, "For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation." In other words, you watch, I'm sending down justice on Jehoiakim by introducing him and all of you to a bitter people, another superpower coming to Judah. Yay? I mean, that's not the kind of answer Habakkuk is looking for. I mean, he is hoping that God would deal with Jehoiakim, but not everybody else. Habakkuk wants the good guys to win. He can probably even think of some good guys in Jerusalem that could replace Jehoiakim. I mean, just solve the problem, God. I mean, surely the last thing that little Judah needs is another powerful and destructive nation state hovering around them like a vulture to consume them. And we can actually kind of see into Habakkuk's thoughts here in his prophecy. We can see he's looking for a different answer than the Chaldeans because he doesn't say, "Oh, okay, I'm glad you got that, God." Instead, he basically restates his plea for justice. He basically asks again. You get the sense that Habakkuk is looking for a do-over. He's saying, "Well, I didn't like that answer. Let's shake the magic 8-ball and see if we get something else." Verse 12, he says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die." I mean, Habakkuk here is clearly nervous about what God is promising about these Chaldeans. The sense of verse 12 is, well, it's more of a question than a statement. It's something like, well, if you send those Chaldeans, God, we're not going to die, right? You're going to take care of him, but not of us. Goes on in 13. He says to God, you God who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly, there's that word again, idly, look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? That's the rephrasing of his plea. In other words, if you hate evil and wrong so much, God, just how is it cool for you to use a new group of evil people to put down the bad guy we already have? I mean, how can you even look at these Chaldeans with those pure eyes of yours? So let's bring this back to us. Why do you think? Why do you think God is being so difficult here? Why is he not just giving Habakkuk what he wants? Why isn't he just making sure Jehoiakim gets pulled over on the side of the road and everybody else can go on their merry way? Why do you think? Well, friends, it's simple, really. It is not like there are just a few bad apples in humanity and we just need God to sort them out for our benefit. Of course, we like to think that. We also like to think we're the good apples, right? No, our problems are deeper than that. Judah's problems were deeper than that. It was not just Jehoiakim, it was the whole people. I mean, after all, Habakkuk himself can see that deep badness will exist, not just in God's own city of Jerusalem and not just in his own chosen people, Israel, who allowed Jehoiakim to come to power, but even in the descendant of God's chosen King David. The rot is deep. It is not simple to excise it and move on. So why? It's never quite as simple as just that guy over there, is it? And on the other hand, there's a saying, I'm not sure where it comes from, that also seems to apply to this situation to me. Maybe you've heard this before. Have you ever heard the saying, God uses broken tools? You heard that? God uses broken tools. And you know, when we're the tools that God is using for his purposes, that can be kind of comforting, right? We can be useful to God even when we are not perfect, even when what we think is going on is not actually what is going on. I mean, that's great, because usually what I think is going on is not actually what's going on. Actually, I was reminded of this a couple weeks ago at our diocesan clergy day. The bishop calls all of us together, and we usually hear from a speaker. This year it was my former boss, Archbishop Duncan, was speaking, and he was talking about how our denomination, the Anglican Church in North America, came about. And actually my seminary, Trinity Seminary, was deeply involved in that. But here's the thing, Trinity Seminary did not think that that was what they were doing. Trinity Seminary was founded to reform another church from the inside, not launch an Anglican church on the outside. And what Archbishop Duncan said was really insightful to me. He said, you know, with God, you don't even have to be all right. You just got to be in the ballpark, and God will use it. And that gave me a lot of comfort. I hope it does you as well. Just have to get it mostly right. But friends, you know what? It is challenging. It is challenging not when we're the broken tool that God is using in spite of ourselves, but when someone else is God's broken tool, some modern-day Chaldeans, for instance, and he is using them to somehow operate on us. That's challenging. So how are we going to deal with this? I mean, I knew we do not have to look back 2,700 years to Habakkuk to find cases where either it seems like the bad guys win or one group of bad guys just replaces another. I mean, most of us probably don't have to look back more than a week or two. And sure, sometimes it does give us a bit of pleasure when our Jehoiakim of a boss is run over by the Chaldeans in accounting. But often it's just kind of scary and naturally leaves us wondering if we have been fed a line about how it's good to be good, when it seems like so often the way life actually works is worse triumphs over bad instead of good triumphs over evil. What do we do with that? Well, let's go back to Habakkuk. How does Habakkuk deal with this pattern, with getting an answer he doesn't understand and doesn't like from God that, frankly, sounds a lot like the worse overcoming the bad? He has some choices. He could have stopped asking. He could have stamped his foot and said, you know, God, I can do better. I'm launching a coup against Jehoiakim. Or he could have pretended to understand and like something he did not understand and like. And instead, he doesn't do any of those things. Instead, if we skip ahead to chapter 2, verse 1, he just says this. He says, I'll take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me, what God will say to me. The sense is he's saying to God, this conversation isn't over, right? He decides to wait and see what God will do. And you know what, friends? Sometimes that's what we have to do as well. Even when the clouds are dark, is just wait and see what God will do. You see, Habakkuk realizes. He realizes that he is not in charge. And it's worth waiting to hear what God says next. And God, for his part, he does say something more to Habakkuk. Something that I think casts light on the most important question we all face, given these facts. Given the fact that sometimes it does seem the world is full of bad people, and often, not all the time, but often it does seem like worse triumphs over bad instead of good triumphs over evil. Look at the very end of the passage we heard this morning, the second half of verse 4 in chapter 2. God just says this. He just says, the righteous, those who are right with me, they'll live by faith. They'll live by faith. You see, God is telling Habakkuk that, look, when the rubber meets the road, trust trumps understanding on this question. That the hallmark, he says, of being God's friend, well, it isn't necessarily getting to command good to beat evil right now, but instead having faith. Faith in God's ultimate goodness and his good plans for us, even when it doesn't look like it. Look, God is saying to Habakkuk, things are going to be messy. The best thing to do about bad Jehoiakim, well, it really is to send the worst Chaldeans down on him. You have to trust me on that. But have faith, he is saying, I will triumph in the end. Goodness, justice, those things you are calling for, they will triumph in the end. Have faith. And you know it's here we actually have to part ways with Habakkuk a little bit, because our situation actually is a little bit different than his. And simply put, we know something that he does not know. Something that is very, very important when it comes to taking God at his word here in this little book of Habakkuk. You see, we know that God's promise to Habakkuk is actually fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Finally, we know that someone truly good, Jesus, met true evil, sin, and death at their very worst, and that he gave them the butt-kicking they so richly deserve on the cross. Bad ultimately is not thrown down by worse, but by the best, by God's own Son. Friends, we must cling to this, particularly in moments when we see the Jehoiakims and Chaldeans in our life at war with each other, and fear we may get inadvertently stepped on, or maybe advertently stepped on. They might mean it. You know, maybe during government shutdowns, for instance. Yeah, it's messy. And it has real consequences for many of us. I do not minimize that. And by the way, if this drags on and you find yourself needing help with things like food or rent, talk to us. We do have help for these things. But friends, God is trustworthy. We can trust him in this and in everything in our lives. You see, that reality makes it easy for us to join Habakkuk, well, actually at the end of his book, in chapter 3, where he has chosen to hope in God's goodness again, even though he still doesn't understand the Chaldeans. In fact, Habakkuk, he ends his prophecy with a song that probably even was part of music in the temple in Jerusalem. And its words are powerful. It's one of my favorite passages in the Bible. You can look at it. Look at chapter 3, starting at verse 17. Habakkuk says this. He says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. In other words, when I can see no signs of God's blessing in my life, yet, he says, I'll rejoice in the Lord. I'll have faith. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Just 3 chapters. We see Habakkuk move from deep distrust of God's plans to full trust and faith. And he does that only with God's promises. We, on the other hand, know Jesus. We know that what God's promised, he has delivered. That God's salvation has blossomed for us through his epic battle with all that is evil on the cross. So this week, let us claim that victory, that reality for ourselves, wherever we are, at home or at work or at school, and certainly and always wherever it seems like the bad guys are winning. Friends, God won. Amen.